You're listening to The Conversation with Model Mind AI, a weekly check-in with Angela Schultz and Loren Horsager on how to lead through change, stay curious, and get AI ready.
Hello and welcome to The Conversation with Model Mind. I'm Loren Horsager, and today Angela has the day off. I am here with a good friend of mine, Mark Caufman, and we're going to be talking about development and AI for development. Now, don't run away if you're not a developer. What we're going to talk about is some of the processes on how we do this for software development, but everything we're going to talk about today applies to AI in general. So as you're building agents and automating processes, it's maybe a little bit more sophisticated already in software development, but this really applies to how we think about AI in general. So with that, Mark, let me just first tell you, Mark and I go back a long, long ways. I don't know, probably about 1998 or so. And we worked at the same company, and we have worked together on and off for basically since then. And Mark, I'll let him tell a little bit what he does, but I've enjoyed working with him over the years, and it's great to have you on the podcast today. So thanks for being here.
Thanks for the opportunity, Loren.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about you and what you're doing and your perspective on AI?
Sure. I've been a software developer for life. Started in fourth grade with Commodore PET computers, and have followed the history of computing all the way up to the present. And artificial intelligence has definitely thrown some challenges into the way that I work, and it's thrown a lot of opportunities in the way that I work. It's been pretty transformational. And my background is I was last a corporate developer, principal engineer for Wells Fargo Bank, and in the Twin Cities. And my wife and I relocated up to St. Cloud, Minnesota. And she went on to do a consulting job up here. And I found myself, with the return to office policies changing, I'm now an independent freelancer helping out local businesses in the St. Cloud area. And it's a lot of fun. I think it's very rewarding being close to the business owners and the decision makers. And they bring a lot of interesting business problems my way to solve. And some of it is legacy software where the original developers have left and moved on, and they need somebody to keep it up. Other times it's been new web applications where we're standing something up, or just integration services. And so my business, Caufman Consulting, has had a fun startup here, and it's really interesting to see how artificial intelligence is changing how I work.
Fantastic. Well, today we want to talk about a term I really, really can't stand, which is vibe coding. And I think it's a terrible term, but we're going to dive into this a little bit about what it means. And you recently went through our class. It's our 405 AI for software developers. So why don't you start off, maybe just give us a little bit of like what your perspective was coming in and leaving that class. And then we can kind of dig into a little bit about like how this changes the game for software development and what that means for people. One thing I would like to talk about a little later in today as well is like, what does this mean for young people coming out of college and in software development careers? Because we're seeing and a lot of differences, I think. And I think that's something that, having the history and the experience that you have, I'd love to get some thoughts on that as well. But why don't you start off just giving a little bit of information about the class and kind of your perspective going in and coming out of that, and how you're using that now.
Sure. I think there's an evolutionary ladder that you start out with when you're integrating artificial intelligence. I think we've had IntelliSense for a long time, where the IDE would help you with completing a line of code, but the context was really just the line of code that you were working on. So if you couldn't remember parameter order, or you needed help spelling variables correctly or picking the right function or method, that was a significant assist to, rather than having to hold it all in your head at once. And then, with the introduction of artificial intelligence in the IDE, where you could make one-shot prompts where at the line of code where you were at, it would suddenly pay attention to more than just the one line of code that you were working on. It would look at your function or your class or your entire module, and it could provide, it would kind of be able to do a better job of guessing your intention. And I think that's where the evolution has been, a hockey stick growth and improvement in quality just in the past year or so is really amazing how the tools help. And I think that's where everybody's saying you can get the primary benefits of artificial intelligence and where it's helping teams move faster. So it's nice when you can make an entire function or code enclosure. You can create multiple related functions. You can do small refactors. I think the really huge value is with generating unit and UI tests and documentation. I think that's the part where most developers just struggle. We want to solve the problem, we want to deliver the results, but we know there's all this code meta that has to be there. And
I think this goes back to like all the things that me as, I'm not a traditional software developer. I switched careers to get into software development back about when I met you. And I think, so I'm not great at, doing unit tests or doing some of the process steps that have to happen. And I think most developers aren't good at documentation and things like that, where the AI now can come alongside us to help us do these processes. And we were just talking a little bit ago that this is actually, before, like I've been a solo developer a lot, and you've been sometimes a solo developer, sometime in teams. And I think as a solo developer, you can a lot of times get by without doing these things. Not that you should, right? But you can. And so for me, it was easy to kind of not do these things. And now what I like is all my code I have unit tests and I have documentation and I have, it's very clear and well thought out. And it's all because the AI comes alongside. But because of that, our process changes, right? And so that's what we need to think about, is how this is affecting our process. And if you're not in software development, the same thing applies to whether you're in marketing or you're in any other business process. Our process has to change a little bit in order to fully take advantage of what AI is possible, right? What's possible with AI.
Absolutely. And, it's one thing when you're on a team and you have to communicate stuff to other people and you're creating this documentation, that's part of the knowledge succession, knowledge transition. But even as a solo developer, when you're constantly going from one project to another and you'll put something down for a month, 2 months, you get rusty on it and you need that documentation. You need that, hey, where did I leave off, or what was the last thing I did? And reading commit logs is one way of doing it. But I think being able to go to the AI and track this stuff and ask the question, interrogate the code, refresh, hey, what does this module do? Or you can create documentation like use Mermaid.js and create markdown text documentation. And that renders as this gorgeous directed graph, whatever. So that visually, you don't have to read a book. You can have these diagrams, and then the associative memory kicks in, and all of a sudden you're back to being productive again. And so the transition time going from task to task, project to project, becomes so much less.
And I think one thing that's happening, we talk about this with agents in general and not just for software development, but agents give us the ability, as it goes through and does something, it creates content around that. And now, like in other agentic systems, we have this ability to actually make a memory system out of that. And now the agent, we can go chat with that, right? So it's less about having the documentation, but the documentation supports that. And so like you're talking about in the development world, the AI is writing documentation, but most of the time, how we're going to go through it is not necessarily to read that documentation. We're going to chat with the AI about it to get to what we need and pull out the pieces we need at the right time, right? Which I think is really cool. We're kind of like, it's more useful to have the documentation now because the AI tool set raises that up and allows us to chat with it to actually have a better process. Just like I would go ask, hey, if you were the developer on this, tell me about this code. How does this work, right? I can go have that conversation with the AI, which I think is really, really interesting because it used to be that, oh, I don't, I'm the developer on this. I don't need documentation on it, as an example, or unit test, or you can go through item after item that way. But now that information supports the AI process and what it's doing, to make it better, because you have to think about, like, you're working in a team with the AI in order to do anything. So all these things are really important, but they're not really, from my old mindset, they're kind of the pain point of doing them. Well, they're not now, because they're actually enabling you to do a much better, more effective job, with the AI co-coding, right?
Yeah, I mean, so much of coding feels like stream of consciousness, but what you want is good architecture, good discipline. It's one thing to create the handholds for handing off the code to someone else, but uh, when you're, there's the past of what you did, and when you're walking into a legacy project and just thousands of lines of code, and you suddenly have to figure out, okay, how do I get my arms around this? Where do I start? That's one thing. And then there's when you're coding in the moment, and then there's the future coding when you're writing specs.
Hmm.
And when you're writing specs, you the question is how much vision you can hold in your head at a time. I still work for the most part kind of a feature at a time. I have an overall design, but I'm still kind of feeling things out. I don't necessarily have the whole structure. But what I can do now, having built enough of these projects, is I actually have a hybrid approach. I have a kind of boilerplate template project that's my starting point. So
Hmm.
I don't have to constantly write a login and authentication and all
Yeah.
these basic integrations. I can start at the application level. And so I can tell the AI, hey, this is my base project, and here's all the specs and the layout and organization of this base project. But then here's the new stuff that we're going to add to it, and here's where this plugs in. And
Hmm.
that's been a huge accelerant for how I'm able to get projects underway and start
Yep.
delivering results to my clients much faster. But
Right.
it's the process of writing a spec and then understanding the problem. Spend a lot of time talking with business users and collecting that information and using artificial intelligence to transcribe those
Yep.
those recorded interviews and be able to get paper and be able to present it to the client and say, this is what we talked about. Did we miss anything? Is there anything that you want to emphasize or clarify? And then taking that and saying, okay, now structure this into a bullet outline and let's help me map this to features about what we're
Yep.
talking about. So that automation of getting the human information and structuring it is a huge help with using artificial intelligence and not having to grind through that stuff, but to
So
actually be able to get to value faster.
I think you raised a really good point, that software development with AI changes this, where we're no longer code monkeys, right? We're really not. I rarely write code anymore, but I do a lot of software development, and it's my job now is, and this is a bad term, but babysit the AI, but also write specs, right? And so you're keeping the AI going, but while I'm doing that, I actually am working in a notepad program or something where I'm actually writing my next spec or my next clarification on what it's creating, in order to keep feeding the AI, feeding the system the information it needs. And this doesn't matter if it's software development or anything else. The AI has access to all your code when you're doing this. And so it knows what's there. And now we give it access to the tools we choose to give it access to, but I like to give it access so it can run and try these things. It can open a web browser, it can log in, it can actually test things, right? I hate it when it comes back and I try to run it and a build breaks, right? So I want it to have already built it and tested it and it failed and now fix the issue, and now it comes back to me. And theoretically, again, this is in, a first stage, so it's not something I would just hit okay and we're ready to go, but it should come back to me where I can run this and now I can go through and do testing, and then I can clarify and I can give it more information to continue to refine, work on the next feature. Usually that what I have is multiple features up at the same time. I'm only working on one. There are ways to do that differently. My head can't handle that.
Right.
So I tend to work on one, but while I'm working on it, you have some free time while the AI is running. I will end up working on the next one and starting to document that. I don't have templates the same way you do, but I have templates of all of the AI prompts. So when we're
Yeah,
talking about Spec Kit, do you want to give a quick walkthrough on Spec Kit and why that makes sense? Because I think the cool thing about Spec Kit is they've taken a standard process and they figured out how to make this work with AI, right?
yeah,
And this applies to any other business process. We just have to think a little differently. So take us through that process.
sure. And this is where the 405 class was transformational for me, because once you start doing this AI stream of consciousness, you're like, okay, I want to do more. I don't want to just, press a key, wait, type in the next prompt, and constantly be in a reactive mode to whatever was produced. I want to be more proactive. I want to provide more structure. And so you go off and you start hunting for recipes and patterns, and what's the secret spells that I should use in order to get results, better results from the AI. And I think what GitHub did was it said, okay, you're going to want to work in a way that follows best practices. You're going to synthesize the project process, but on an individual level. So it's you and the AI. And now you become the project manager as a developer, which is kind of an interesting change of seats. But you go from Make-A-Wish or prompt roulette to a much more structured process. And what GitHub did was, first you describe your project. You've got a constitution that
Mhm.
explains all the ways that you want this project to operate, in terms of what components are in it, in terms of your coding standards, all those dry documents about, what do you use for naming? Is it camel case, Pascal case, screaming snake case? Um, you get to set those rules for how the code will be pretty, and you also get to influence it where you take ideas from clean code and from other pragmatic programmer, single responsibility principle,
Mhm.
the code structure, the naming standards. If you can limit the amount of verbs that you use to describe things, I mean, are you going to say you're going to handle something, or are you going to be a click handler, or are you going to be apply? I mean, there's all these ways that, as you're working on a project and you're in the thick of something, you choose names that are just spur of the moment. And with AI, it can finally be disciplined about this, follow a recipe, follow a pattern. And now all of a sudden your code becomes so much clearer. But you settle this stuff up in a constitution that's kind of, okay, every time that we make a request, here's the overall framework for how you should think about this. And
Mhm.
there's some cost to that because it's extra context tokens. But for what it does in terms of ensuring a stable output is tremendous. I think that's the thing that, once I started applying that to my legacy projects and my new projects are fun because you get to start from scratch. You've got
Right.
no initial um, technical debt. You've got no legacy inconsistencies.
Yep.
But when you go to a legacy project, and you kind of have to coach it through that, because you have to say, okay, here's the way the code is today. Here's where we want to go to. I'm going to provide separate tasks where we do the refactoring, we do the renaming, we do the restructuring. But each of those is going to be some step that moves you closer. So you start out with a constitution that describes the way things are, the way things you want them to be. And then you get to move into the step of specifying, where you actually get to do something a little more sophisticated than the standard agile. As a X, I want to, so that, that recipe for agile has been around for a long time, but it's really kind of frustrating because it's the human way of approaching it, but it's not the technology way of doing it. So the specify
But
stuff.
but but
Yeah,
I love that because it doesn't matter. You can use whatever terminology, and this is the fantastic thing about natural language and AI, right? So I've never followed that very well because most of the things I do are independent. I'm a solo developer usually.
yeah,
So I understand that, and I sometimes have to read them if a client created those, but that's not how I document things. And I'm also not completely in the technical world of just like, here's a technical, like old school kind of tech spec. It's usually somewhere in between. And the fantastic thing is, I actually use another process usually, and I spend a lot of time in my car driving, and I have a custom GPT set up specifically for this process. Actually, I have a couple of them depending on the technology that I may be using. And I will describe things and it'll actually write out user stories for me automatically, which
Oh,
then I can take those user stories. What I do is I say, okay, summarize all these user stories. Okay, here's 25 user stories. Well, then I say, you know what? These 5 user stories are my next feature. So again, I'm taking this offline while I'm driving. I'm talking about ideas like how do I do this? How do I do that? And dialoguing them, say, okay, let's put that into user story. Now I take that from one platform, then I drop it in my code solution, my AI coding tool, and I've narrowed it down to say, now this is a feature. Here's the 5 user stories for this feature that I want to solve, right? But I love that it's natural language because they don't have to be written in any particular way. It figures it out, which is fantastic. So oddly enough, because I use this process with a custom GPT, it's usually writing them in the same format, but doesn't matter. You could translate that to any other format you wanted to do, how are you going to do your user stories and your tech spec for that. So,
yeah. But
but
GitHub has that whole cycle where you go from specify where you're kind of at a high level, and then you go to clarify because you start looking at, okay, what's the extra details? Where's my edge cases? But then you say plan. And plan is where it goes in and looks at your code about what's currently there and what's missing and what it needs to generate. And the plan is where you actually come in as a developer and start adding value because you're like, okay, is this complete? Is this going to produce the right result? Um, is there, you get to see something concrete, so much of, well, it gets you away from the stream of consciousness where you're just kind of
mhm,
as you go. It gives you structure. It helps you check yourself. And the interesting thing as a solo developer, or even as a corporate developer, but as a solo developer, you're working on your own. So you always got that inferiority complex or imposter syndrome that says, am I really, is this complete enough? And having an AI to bounce this stuff off of and check for
mhm,
completeness at a time, it lets you have that inspection step, that validation step where you feel like, okay, I can see it in my head. I now see it in words and structure. This makes sense as a plan. And you go from a plan to a checklist. Here's the individual modules you're going to touch. Here's the functions that are going to get hit and how they're going to get touched. And then you go from that to tasks. What order
mhm,
should you do these things in? How do I do
mhm.
this in a stable way that I don't break the world, but it's in steps that flow with each other? And in the tasks and the steps, you make sure that you include unit testing and
Mhm.
integration, so that there needs to be some feedback mechanism that you build into your development process that tells you when it's correct. This is the part where GitHub Spec Kit uh, really changed how I work because it gave me a way to tell the AI when it was done. And so it's a verification step. It's some extra logic that says, don't just deliver this and bail. Make sure this is a complete solution with all these things.
Right.
And you get that extra step where it lets the AI keep working because now it knows how to measure the results of what it's doing to see, is this really deliverable? And you
Exactly.
don't, and you don't get to implement code until the very last steps. You're doing all
Right.
the eat your vegetables, good habits, discipline kinds of things.
So
And
this is interesting in
yeah,
class, we have this, our 405 class is a 3 hour class. And I think it's funny because I was teaching this class last week to a client. It was all from the same client everybody there. And it was funny, we're little over 2 hours in, and we're like, wait a second, we haven't written any code yet. And I'm like, exactly, right? And that's the unique thing. And then we kick this off and it started the implementation and it created our project, right? We were creating a .NET project, and it's funny. And I was joking that it's like, okay, now this still isn't super impressive, right? Because literally it created our project, and I could have done this in about 2 minutes with .NET New and created this project, right? But the fact is, we now have everything set up for it to understand how this is going to work going forward, and that's where the value comes in. So now the next part of the feature, the next step of this gets really, really powerful. And that's where, but it takes a long time to get there to kind of blow people away. But then once they start to see it, like, oh, it created the project and then it did this and it did this and it did this and it did this, and they all work. And, we had a running project a half hour later, which was pretty cool, right? Especially when it was in a technology that they weren't familiar with. So that's a fun process when you realize that You spend a lot of time getting this set up. One of the great things, though, I do want to talk about migrations a little bit
Yeah.
because I think this is a super valuable thing. So, um, when we started working on kind of thinking about how to use specs to help with this process, then we found GitHub Spec Kit. There are other solutions out there, and I've tested some of them. I think they're all potentially good. They're a little different. You just kind of have to figure out what works for you. But that's the one we teach on because it's pretty well supported from Microsoft slash GitHub. And but traditionally they didn't handle existing projects very well. And now I think it's really interesting because the tools and partially because the AI context windows are so big that they do a great job of actually of getting set up and pulling all the information in an existing project and going back and basically adding the documentation you need to understand this project so that now you can use the AI with it to effectively to make it work. And what's cool about that is that's the process for doing migrations. And we did a project here where we converted from Microsoft Xamarin to Microsoft Maui, and it's a painful process, right? I was trying to do this by hand, and it was just a clunky process. There's all sorts of changes that are not fun, and we ended up pulling this all in. And what I was trying to figure out is how do you actually pull in the previous knowledge, but it wasn't a migration in the sense that I didn't need all the same classes and same structure. So I didn't just want to pull this in. What I did is I created a new project in Maui, and I created a folder for my past project inside of my new project. And I just made a copy of it there. So it didn't have any of the Git stuff, but it was just the current version of this. And then I refer to that folder a lot when I'm talking to the AI. So I'm like, hey, I need a pop-up here that looks like this pop-up on in this old the previous code page like this, and it needs to work like this, but I want to make these changes, right? Or I need it to work with the current system as we've designed this with the changes we're making. And I think it's so interesting. It works really well, and it pulls in so much of the information about the project that even on an existing project, we can actually, number one, document existing projects, so we understand it. As well as then build on that, including, I think this is hilarious. I've wanted to build different things. I'm like, you're trying to figure out how to do this. And I'll go out on GitHub and find some open source code. And you're like, okay, how do I build this idea? But I don't want it in that platform. I want it in a different platform, right? So maybe I've been trying to learn Rust, and I'm like, well, I want to take this Python code and convert it to Rust. And I'm like, here's a library that's out there that's doing this in Python. Now I want to build mine in Rust. How can I do that? And I could just point at that, right? Which is such an interesting thing that it doesn't really like you can do language translation so easy in like coding language translation in with the AIs, which is just kind of fascinating. And then like all your frameworks are changing and everything else is changing, but it figures that out, and it really, it allows you to basically in a very simplistic way say, hey, I want to do what they're doing over here, but how do I do it? And give me a plan, but then help me step through and make decisions on how I implement that to get the best result in the technology I'm trying to, in the language and platform I'm trying to make that work.
I want to ask you, when you do that with the prior generation, version previous code, you don't want to feed it that entire code base with every prompt. You're doing some kind of summarization or excerpting, something to save yourself tokens, aren't you? Where you don't necessarily want to consult the direct code every time, but maybe you just need to know enough.
No, you're only using it in two cases. So
Okay.
one is when you set up the project and you're doing your constitution, you're specifying all those initial commands, it's going out and reviewing what's there and pulling that in and adding it to its markdown files that are stored in the project, right? So
Yes.
just like you would when you're creating a new project. So it's going out and identifying a whole bunch of that information. The other time is when I'm building a specific feature and I say, hey, this feature is to build out this page, let's say. And here's where the old one was, and I want to use that same logic, but we need to update it. And here's what changes when we update it. Then I'm going back and pulling in very specific pages of the old code. So I might have, 1,000 pages files in the old code. I'm saying refer to the UI and the code behind however
Okay.
that, and pull those in to explain how this works. That's really how I'm doing it, and that ends up allowing us to um, take advantage of what was there, but it also allows us to improve on that. So I have this project that I did this conversion on, and we had a whole bunch of pop-ups that weren't quite the same, and they were similar, and it wasn't a big issue. But my client just, I've got a couple of messages this week from the client, and they're like, it just looks so nice now because everything is exactly the same. Like it's exactly and it's consistent, right? And I didn't do that, but I told that before we started the conversion, I'm like, here's what we're doing, here's what we're building on, create the project. And then I had it create some of the templates for pop-ups, how we're going to do pop-ups in the new system. And then go point at this, and it pulled the information about what has to be there, but it's using the new look on how we're doing pop-ups. And so it's just consistent across the entire application, which is a great way of, like, you're taking over a code base that's already been around. Like, how do you improve that? How do you get rid of some of that technical debt that this doesn't tie to this? Like that, it's a real opportunity to do that with AI, and it's a very powerful process.
If you're using React, Angular, we're in the brave new world of components. And corporate developers are always dealing with design systems. You have to be compliant
Mhm.
with branding. You have to be compliant with what's, the identity of the organization. And that's a significant cognitive load for a developer who just wants to put a new field onto a form or
Right.
some computational kind of thing. And so the fact that AI provides you that consistency because it's going to follow that as instructions. Here's my styling standard.
Right.
Uh, what that does for user satisfaction is tremendous because the cognitive load, the dialogues always appear in the same place. They always have the same dimensional shape that they're supposed to. The
Hmm.
margins are right, the padding is right. I mean, everything just looks crisp. So you get
Hmm.
all those benefits of consistent design, even as an indie, where you don't necessarily have a graphic designer on staff, you don't
Yep.
have a UX designer, but you can follow some standards, and you don't have to just inherit from Bootstrap, but you can also design a particular standard for your client.
Hmm.
And once you explain that, those rules are in there, and
Yeah.
that kit, the AI will follow that, and it's a huge quality improvement.
I've been doing some research lately. There's been a lot of things on design with AI. So we talk about software development, but there's all these other areas that we touch as software developers, right? Like, and design tends to be kind of on the periphery, but we do, especially as indie developers, you're touching it all the time. And I think I've been testing this a little bit, and this seems to work quite well. So there are design languages and how to actually define your design for an app, right? And there's things like, okay, I have a Figma design or something like that, and you can connect to those tools. And there's MCP servers for all that now, which is fantastic. But there's also the ability to say, hey, here's an image of something I like. How do I take that and actually just feed it in, but then quantify what that design means, right? And so there's kind of a pre-project setup process where you're basically quantifying these designs, and then it's going to go pull out and actually put this not into any, it's just a text format, but it's going to basically say, hey, when I'm doing cards, here's my rounded corner size, and here's my color on this, and here's my standard colors, and here's foreground and background colors. And it's just laying that all out in a text document, which is great. You can feed that into your spec kit stuff, and actually then you end up with a style guide, which is in text all of the information about this, right? Including colors and whatnot that you might need throughout the project. So from me being a technical person and less of a design person, I just think it's such a nice thing that it's all in there. And then the AI picks up on that as it's designing. You don't have to do this. I haven't done this on most projects, but I think there's a process that we're going to be adding at some point that will actually allow us to have even more control over the design without really having to think about the design, and the AI just applies it, but it's maybe a little bit more locked down up front, especially if you're trying to meet corporate branding structure and stuff. So
Right, right. And it also helps you in prototyping because now you've got a recipe for what stuff is supposed to look like. And so if you just want to design, a very simple structure where there's no code logic, but you want to demonstrate navigation, or you want to demonstrate pop-ups or the assistive tools, you know, with my clients, the sooner that I can put something in their hands to get their feedback about the flow of things, about the order of things on the screen, the way that the workflow works. That is such a confidence builder for them. And
Mhm.
typically this stuff, you can use a Figma or something, but if you've got something that you can just throw on your laptop, walk over and have a desktop one-on-one and get that affirmation that you're going in the right direction,
Mhm.
and you can present that to a team or a group, but you look more productive, but you get to take that generated code and say, okay, here's a working example. AI says,
Mhm.
hey, if you can give me an example of what's good, an example of what's bad, I know how to proceed in a particular direction, and I know how to avoid what you don't want. And
Mhm.
that's really a key prompting skill, that as a developer, you hate having all this reference material that you have to go to. But for AI, that's where all the value is. And as a
Yeah.
developer, you develop it, it becomes an asset with the project, and you can refer back to it. You've got
Mhm.
this library of content that saves you tokens because you don't necessarily have to describe it or provide a screenshot every time. It becomes codified, and it becomes part of your prompting process that gets injected at the right time for the particular task that you're doing.
Right. Right. So let's raise this up a little bit. What do you
Sure.
think, based on what you've seen, and how you've been using like Spec Kit and just as you're developing, what do you think the pros are of this process, and not just process, but AI in general when it comes to software?
Well, it's vibe coding, not vibe engineering. I think having the structure and the discipline and the recipe to follow, uh, the consistency and the validation and the volume of output that you get, that's really the huge advantage. That's where you become a 10x developer as a solo indie kind of, you can punch way above your weight, um,
Mhm.
because you can deliver so much faster, of much higher quality, and it gives you rigor in your own mind.
Mhm.
You start looking at problems in a different way because you're not caught up in the little trivial details. And when you have to approach something that you don't understand or you've never done before, you can be a lot more fearless about it because you can say,
Mhm.
okay, this is where vibe coding has its place, because you can say, I've never written in Swift, I've never written in Rust.
Yep.
Show me an example program of what that looks like. And as an experienced developer, I've seen enough of these things. I can pattern match, I see the structures, and all of a sudden I can teach myself to be an at least better than novice, at least an informed developer. I mean, you can still get in trouble with code you don't understand, some technology you haven't used before. You don't know necessarily whether it's giving you a good example or a bad example, but you you test it and you learn something that at least you can have informed questions that lead you on a structured path so that you can get better faster.
Yep.
You know what to ask for, and you can recognize if it's looking like an inefficient way of doing it, because you can say, do this in idiomatic code that's native to this language structure. Don't let me carry over JavaScript
Yep.
into Python. And do this in an efficient way that follows these coding standards. Like with Python, you got PEP and other things that, if you're going to write proper Python code, you should follow as a Python developer.
Right.
And it's a lifetime to learn that stuff and make it intrinsic to you. But with artificial intelligence, it's going to inherit all of that. And so it can
Right.
produce stuff. And you start learning from good examples rather than just whatever you can find on the internet that may or may not be relevant to the problem you're working on.
So I think this is interesting. I have a good friend who I've been coaching for about 4 months, and he's actually built his own SaaS product. He's never coded before.
Wow.
He's an amazing designer. He's a PhD in design, and but he's never coded. And he has written his own software using these tools and has published his app, and it's out there for companies to basically convert a brand from one brand to another in like mobile apps and web apps and stuff. And it's a fantastic way that like non-developers can actually do something incredibly powerful. Um, but that doesn't mean that I'm not saying it's easy, because you still have to guide and have to think through the process. And this is where, um, software developers, I think, have traditionally kind of solved for that, or software teams have solved for that, where business people kind of left things out on, I need this, but there's some gaps, right? And now you're kind of, you suddenly figure out that, oh, there's lots of gaps that I have to think about. How do I want the authentication to work? How do I want this product process to work? And it's complicated, but you get to make decisions, and you get to try and maybe fail at those decisions and then adjust and do them a different way, right? But a non-developer, it is an incredible tool for learning software development, which maybe brings me to one of my negatives, which I was talking to a guy yesterday, and they went and were visiting what I'd probably consider a top 20 school in the country, college, and everybody know it. And they basically said, no, we're not going to teach computer science people about AI because don't think you should be using it. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, that is a crazy mentality. But I find it very interesting in wherever we're teaching people, and I don't care if it's software or marketing or any kind of business area. We find there's two areas that it tends to be a little bit challenging. So the first area is people that are really close to retirement. And the second area, but usually in a couple hours, they see this as a task, a tool, and it's a very, very, like, they adapt, and now they can apply that, right? But then the second place that it has the same problem is with young people that are just out of college. And the challenge there is that they have been told over and over and over that this is evil and it's bad, and I'm not supposed to use it, right? And I have a friend of mine that has a young marketing person just out of college, and it has been a challenge getting her to actually implement some of this. She's gone through our classes and stuff, but she's like, I've been told over and over and over, don't use this. And I think it's a shame that we need to be talking about how to use it, but more importantly, how to think while using it, because that's really the gap, right? We need these critical thinking people that are helping understand, what do I want? Why do I want that? How can I make that work? But yet some of the task stuff, which in software development, a lot of it is task-based, just write some code. Well, we're kind of removing that from the equation. Now it's more important though, how do I think about the problem? How do I architect this? How do I communicate about this? And so I think it changes that mentality, but that younger group, like going through school and stuff, I think is really at a disservice if they're not getting some hands-on experience with this and learning how to adapt, and not just in software development, but across the board.
Yeah, there's a blanket ban is far too heavy-handed of an approach. I think everybody has stories about how AI went down the rabbit hole and created spaghetti call trees, created hugely inefficient, unoptimized use. Dead code from prior iterations was conserved instead of deleted. Basically, the AI coded around something when it should have completely refactored and replaced. You can't trust version 1.0 in production.
Yeah.
And I think, but all that being said, if you're using tools like SpecKit, if you're inspecting and you're evaluating, and there's still space for code reviews and things,
yeah,
where you want another set of eyes looking things over, thinking about edge cases. I think the reason why you use AI is that you don't know the technology. You need education from a working example. You don't know the best solution path. You want to prototype, you want to experiment, you want to see what different structures look like. If you have to do that by hand, it's going to take you forever. But if you use an artificial intelligence, you can get a number of solutions and pick the best one. Urgency trumps quality in some cases. You need to put something out there, and you can't ignore quality, but you have to pay attention to the urgency.
But with this process, the quality is you can program in the quality into your spec kit up front, which I think what I think is great about this whole process is that now all these things that as a solo developer I didn't quite find valuable are now incredibly important to the process. but they're adding value. So you want to do them and you spend the time doing them because your result is so much more impactful. Which it's not just, hey, you should do this. It's like, no, this is going to get you the result you want, which is really cool to see. So I love that that's all kind of come together, at least for me, not being a great software developer. It's like you kind of can now see that all these things matter and how they matter, and it gets applied on every call I make because I've set it up right to do it this way, right? So,
Right.
okay, last topic. I jokingly talk about when I'm speaking a lot about how I set up some agents, and this is different than the process we're talking about, but a couple years ago I did this. I set up some agents where they were each a coder, and I gave one a positive personality and the other a negative personality. And
Yeah.
I always joke that I'm a very positive person, a very positive developer, and I've worked with you a long time. I would say that I'm not saying you're a negative person, but I will say you're a negative developer, and I think I have always valued that, even though it frustrates me to no end because there's value like you're going to look at something and find all the ways something can't work, which there's huge value in that, right? And my takeaway from and I'm going to look at it, I'm like, well, let's get this out. It works and it runs for 90% of the cases. Well, that's not good enough in a lot of cases, right? So it's like, how do we make things better? And one of the things I think is really interesting now, and this doesn't just apply to software development, with AI, giving it the personality is actually a really, really big deal. So I did this test where I ran for 4 hours. I think I did like 75,000 AI calls or something, and it wrote some code and it wrote it really well, but I had a positive and negative developer. And it's so fascinating going back and looking at the logs of how they talk to each other and how the negative developer kept saying, well, what about, and finding all these issues. And then the positive one's like, well, let's just take care of it then. Let's do this. And then it's solving, but together they're actually working on a better solution. And I think as we think about, agents, which is really kind of the future of where this is all going, how do we think about this in a multi-agent system where it's not just one perspective, it's not just one way of doing it, but ultimately we get more value, just like we do in a human context when we have you and I working on something together or other people working on something together. It's like you're pulling in all your past knowledge and your history, but also your approach to do something. And we're going to have different approaches. So there's not like a one way wins all. I think that's really cool. And I think in 2026, we're going to see more of that, which I just find really interesting. But the value that comes out of that, we've seen again and again when we actually go look at the logs when we can do this, is incredibly powerful. And it's powerful in real life, right? It's been powerful for the things we've worked on together, but it's also hugely powerful as we're thinking about this from an AI perspective. And this doesn't matter if we're building CFO agents or we're building development agents or whatever it is, that perspective really matters in how this works. So
Yeah. As an indie developer, you're always worried that it's just what I think.
hmm
So that gets to be a real challenge for your confidence because you're like, what if I'm wrong? But I think the way that you're working is more automated than my approach. I'm still working kind of a step at a time with a more sophisticated virtual pair programmer who's really augmenting my skills. I get to do the creative work and the automation does the scut work. And so I get to focus on the solution. I think even back in the old days when you were more of the optimist and I was the skeptic, we both had a delivery focus. But the delivery focus was you wanted to put something into their hands that was going to radically revolutionize what they were doing and how they were doing it. And I wanted to produce something that was really reliable because I'd seen too many naive solutions fall flat on their face in production. And so I'm always looking for, well, what's the part we haven't thought or considered yet? And so between the two of us, with you being the balloon taking us off into the skies and with me being the rock holding us back on the ground, it was a great balance. And that
Right.
diversity of perspective is really why team programming is so rewarding because you got the
Yeah.
senior developers, the junior developers, and the different perspectives where the senior developer is going to have this supreme confidence, and then the junior developer says something, oh yeah, but what about this? Or what's about this other tool or this other new approach? And then the senior developer is kind of knocked on his heels going, oh yeah, that. I got to think about it. And the fact that you can automate these things and develop agents with personalities that'll bounce stuff off each other and operate at machine speed rather than human negotiation speed. That's the radical transformation. I mean, if you can articulate the application goal well enough that you can hand it off and then have agents that are guided and instructed well enough that you can have a strong confidence in their result, that's where now you become a 100x developer.
Right, exactly.
That's the really amazing part. You can take on much larger projects because you're more doing the orchestration and the going from the virtual world to the actual business, the business people that you're serving.
Right. I think it's interesting. All this comes down to this makes us more human, not less human. Like all these processes are about how do we as humans do this? Whether it's, hey, I need to write a spec and I need to write documentation. Like all these are things we should have been doing, even though we skip sometimes. But ultimately, this is making us more human in the process we're doing. And the same in this personality piece, right? It's like, it's all about how would I do this as a human? What is the value of doing this as a human? The same value is there in doing this in an AI context, which I just think is fascinating how we're thinking about this need. Like if we always revert to how a human does it, you're almost always going to be in a better position to think about it. So
yes.
Excellent. Well, Mark, thank you for joining us today. And I feel that we might want to get you back on here again soon. It's been a very enjoyable conversation. Hopefully there's value to this. I think it's always an interesting process. If anybody's interested, we do offer our AI for software developers class. And I think it's a highly valuable class. And in my opinion, it's probably the most valuable class we teach, actually, because you literally, it changes your mindset on how you think about this, and you can 10x what you're doing as a developer. Now that there comes with, there's some steps that you have to do in that process, but you end up with better code. So I think your quality goes significantly up, your quantity goes significantly up, and you can deliver a lot more. So if you want to join us, go to modelmind.ai and you can look up our classes there and figure out when the next scheduled one is. And we would love to have you. If you have questions, reach out. We would love to talk to you. And thank you for being here today. And we look forward to our next conversation. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Loren.
Thanks for being part of the conversation with Model Mind AI. Until next time, keep leading, keep learning, and stay curious.